Today's hearing is about Runit Dome, a concrete tomb for radioactive waste from U.S. nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands. To understand this, we need to go back 75 years.
Hi, it's Lacey, and this is Things That Go Boom. You might not have caught it, this congressional hearing from October. It flew under the radar a bit.
A 50% rise in cancer rates, eviction from ancestral islands, and the permanent destruction of a way of life.
California Representative Katie Porter chaired the hearing. It was about the Marshall Islands.
It is especially shocking to revisit this chapter in our history.
The Republic of the Marshall Islands is way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Population about 60,000. Maybe you've seen the warnings around climate change, that large parts of the islands could become uninhabitable as sea levels rise. But this hearing, it was about something else. Something that happened more than half a century ago. Something that's suddenly taking on new urgency as our national security landscape begins to shift. And the hearing was also kind of interesting because if you can believe it, there was bipartisan support for the Marshallese position. As in, Republicans and Democrats actually agreed on something. To understand what they agreed on, Calvin Ryerse filed a report that takes us not to the Pacific, but to Arkansas, to a town known for its rodeo and for its meatpacking plant. That's on the other side of the break.
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
When I was a senior in high school, I made a, let's say, beginner documentary about the changing demographics of my hometown, Springdale, Arkansas. However technically deficient I find the film now, it was really my love letter to that place and time. I produced it just a few months before I moved to New York City for college. It's nostalgic. I'm transported to sunsets over the Ozarks and marching band performances at Friday night football games. My final day of shooting was with this band, Mark Harmony. Right before the interview, we grabbed tacos at Taqueria Don Guerrero on Emma Street.
Whoa! Okay there.
At this point, Mark Harmony had just been formed, but I could already tell that they were going to be big.
Each time you hear a sad guitar, know that I'm with you the only way that I can be.
In the 2 years since I recorded that tape, Mark Harmony has exploded online. They now have thousands of followers on Instagram and TikTok. The thing is, though, Matt, RC, Reagan, and Cairo aren't just excellent musicians.
The way I would describe Mark Harmony as a band is, first, we're not just a boy band, we're a Marshallese boy band.
That's Matt, one of the band's singer-songwriters. He's talking about the Marshall Islands, a tiny chain of 29 volcanic atolls in the middle of the Pacific.
All of us are Marshallese, and we all have that same goal in mind, to raise awareness about what happened to our homeland in 1946.
There's the target. Bomb away.
From 1946 to 1958, the United States tested 67 nuclear bombs at Bikini Atoll and in the waters near Enewetak Atoll.
Flame, crushing force, and deadly radioactive water is seen falling in a killing mist as the great circular wall of sea closes in on
the testing led to a mass migration of the Marshallese to the mainland United States, with large communities established in the Pacific Northwest and my state, Arkansas.
It's not only part of our nuclear legacy, like our own dark nuclear legacy. It's pretty much in our DNA now, right? As Marshallese.
My high school friend Dexter now lives and goes to college in the islands. He's pursuing a degree in medical laboratory science to become a women's health doctor there. According to the Marshall Islands Ministry of Health and Human Services, women are 10 times more likely to be diagnosed with cervical cancer than women in the United States.
So the U.S. already had control over the Marshall Islands after taking it back from Japan during World War II. They went to Bikini Atoll, and they asked our traditional chief, our Iroj, that this testing would be for the good of mankind. Our chief went forth with it because this foreigner says it'll be for the good of everyone. So it's all in the hands of God, right? There was about 160 inhabitants in that atoll, and they were all displaced.
Flown from Rongerik to witness the historical event is King Judah, ruler of Bikini. It was he who unselfishly gave his island to the United States in order that these experiments could be conducted.
In 1954, the U.S. began a series of tests with especially high-yield explosions.
On March 1st, they dropped Castle Bravo, and that bomb was 1,000 times stronger than the bomb they dropped on Hiroshima.
There is the ball of fire. The maximum temperature reached at the center of this ball shortly after detonation exceeds even the temperature of the sun.
To this day, you can still find accounts of our elders and how they were on nearby atolls and how it was almost like a second sun was present that day. As the late Minister Tony de Broom said, it's like you put a glass bowl over the earth, then you pour blood on it. The skies were just red.
The fallout from Castle Bravo caused widespread environmental contamination. People had burns, blisters, and hair loss almost immediately following the testing. Cancers, like the one that Dexter is studying, became all too common in the following years. And most disturbingly, reports emerged of women giving birth to jellyfish babies, children without bones.
It gets me chilled every time I talk about it, every time I read it. It's just how can we, a really simple island people, be subject to such devastation, right?
By 1979, the Republic of Marshall Islands became sovereign from the United States. 4 years later, the two countries signed a compact of free association. This meant people from the islands could travel to the U.S. without visas and seek work and education. However, in exchange, the United States ensured that the Marshallese could not take legal action against the government for the testing, and they could retain their military bases. Today, Springdale has the largest population of Marshallese outside the islands themselves. It's also the headquarters to Tyson Foods. They really run the town. And a lot of Marshallese have found work in Tyson's chicken plants. In fact, they account for 30% of Tyson's workforce in Springdale. And that's brought a whole new health risk to the community.
Tyson Foods releasing its report from COVID-19 testing at the Springdale Berry Street plant. It found that 199 workers tested positive. Only one person...
COVID-19 raged through the meatpacking plants early on. The Marshallese in Springdale were one of the hardest hit communities in the country. A CDC study concluded they were at a particularly high risk of dying from COVID due to an overrepresentation of chronic illnesses and a lack of access to health care. These issues are inextricably linked to the nuclear testing. But even in the face of another horrible health challenge, the community continues to thrive and adapt. Mark Harmony has been on the front lines. They've been using social media to share information about the virus in Marshallese and encouraging masking.
You see it in the community how people support each other. It's kind of like a family community. And I see it with the way the people that live here support us.
Yo, quit. It's Mark Harmony, and we're back at it again.
Through a sponsor, the band is supposed to make a trip to the islands in the coming months. For everyone except Cairo, it will be their first time visiting their homeland.
Oh, sweet Marshall Islands, you were my homeland. We won't forget you.
So for me, it's going to be honestly emotional. I know I've never been there, but I could still feel their love for the island. You know, they cherish the islands with all of their hearts.
Meanwhile, Republican Congressman Steve Womack and Democratic Congresswoman Katie Porter have been pushing to give the Marshallese the same benefits as other lawful U.S. residents. These include federal nutrition and education assistance, benefits that were taken away in a 1996 welfare reform law. Etched into the DNA of the Marshallese is the bomb and its horrors. And even 60 years later and thousands of miles away from their homeland, in a landlocked southern town, they're fighting to rectify the carry-on effects of this injustice.
That's Calvin Ryerse.
I'm thinking about these kids growing up in the U.S. who have never been to the Marshall Islands. And I just think about them singing these songs about the nuclear testing. This is their legacy. This is their legacy. I mean, what a tragic legacy to leave.
That's Rhea Christian. She chairs the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission. And she's one of the people who testified at that hearing we mentioned in the introduction.
My mother, who was 10 years old living on Ailuk Atoll during the Bravo test, the 1954 Bravo test. She was 10 years old. She remembered hearing the blast, and she woke up and everybody in the house was gone. Like they left her in bed. They all ran into the interior of the island, and she was scared. And then a couple of days later, she remembered that a Navy ship came ashore. Imagine a giant U.S. military ship coming into your lagoon. It was the first time she'd seen a white man. So she was really scared. And the community was told not to drink any water that had already been collected, like rainwater, to not eat coconuts and not eat breadfruit. And Ailuk, her atoll, received very high levels of fallout where they should have been evacuated. That community should have been evacuated. And that is in U.S. documents.
This is one point that Marshallese insist on. Some islanders were evacuated. Others were not. Rhea believes it was considered inconvenient logistically to evacuate her mom.
The U.S. government made a decision to leave them there. And then my mom passed away from stomach cancer about 12 years ago. She was an otherwise very healthy person. And I remember when she got her diagnosis, the first thing she thought of was her radiation exposure as a young girl. I mean, how could you not? And she talked about it from the time she was diagnosed till the time she died was about 15 months. And she talked about it the whole time. I mean, right up until the end. Yeah, I think everyone has a story like that. That's my story, and I'm not alone.
Could you just give me a brief overview of what happened and why?
Yeah. Well, let's rewind to 1945. And after World War II has essentially ended the Hiroshima, Nagasaki aftermath, Japan has been essentially immobilized by the bombings. And the U.S. is sitting on this incredible technology that is the nuclear weapon. And you have some U.S. officials who are eager to see more. They don't consider that the threat of the Soviet Union at the time is over. And they feel that now is the time to really bolster that technology, to really shore up U.S. military capability. And the Pacific is the theater to do that now. So the first test series was at Bikini Atoll, and it was Operation Crossroads.
The first tests were devised to measure the effects of a nuclear bomb on naval warships. So decommissioned ships were parked around the blast. Some were loaded with live animals, like pigs and goats. And those blasts, and the dozens that followed, they went on for more than a decade.
The stat that I think is most interesting is the scale of the tests over that 12-year period, those 67 tests, was equivalent to testing one Hiroshima-sized bomb every day for 12 years.
Wow.
That's the equivalent of the 67 tests. So you take a Hiroshima-sized bomb and you detonate that every day for 12 years, and you get the equivalent yield of the 67 tests that were detonated in the Marshall Islands.
Unbelievable. And you think about the kind of contamination that exists just in Japan. You know, it's not like just because it was a test versus an attack, the contamination isn't still a part of the situation, right?
Right.
I think people, for some reason, have a disconnect there. There are real people who are impacted no matter what, whether we're testing these things or actually using them.
Right. Yeah. A test doesn't mean it's in a lab where people are safe and secure. I mean, the clips that you heard in that segment, those were the propaganda clips that the U.S. put together to try to shore up public support. They had to.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. Do you think anyone really knew what they were agreeing to?
Yeah.
I just have to be really frank on that point because it's very hard for me to hear that.
Yeah. And to that point, King Judah was told by the U.S. military, they was asked, quote, to do it for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. That's a proposition that would be pretty hard to refuse, right? I'm not sure if someone was selling you to end all world wars, there's any way you could possibly say no. I don't know what your reaction is to that framing.
Well, yeah, exactly what you said. How could you say no? How could you say, no, I'm not for world peace? But we don't know if people were really told what might happen. This could go horribly wrong. You know, there could be a lot of contamination. Did people really understand the implications and the risks?
Yeah.
After the March 1954 test, it was a couple months later, and a group of Marshallese leaders submitted a petition to the United Nations for the U.S. to stop the testing. And that was the first time that Marshallese people spoke out. And the reasons were related to the increased displacement of people from lands, but also the health impacts of all of that fallout from that test and people getting sick. After that petition, the U.S. proceeded with its next two test series. That was in 1954 for the next 4 years and tested for another 4 years.
And what do we know today about what are some of the implications and the short-term and long-term impacts?
Well, aside from a couple of islands no longer existing because they were blown quite literally out of the water, it's unsafe. The islands are unsafe. The contamination levels are too high for people to safely live there.
Rhea says this is especially devastating when people can't go back to their ancestral land, which is passed down the maternal line in the Marshall Islands. It's a key part of your identity. The fallout also devastated people's health. And so if you get cancer in the Marshall Islands today, what are your options?
If you are treatable, then you might be lucky to get a referral to either the Philippines, most likely the Philippines or the U.S., to be treated, or you're on your own to go overseas. We have no oncology in the Marshall Islands.
And high rates of cancer, correct?
Extremely high rates. Yeah, I mean, I am as flabbergasted as you. And, you know, to think that a nation that has been exposed to the levels of radiation that we have, it doesn't make any sense.
Cancer cases multiplied after the tests. And since 1961, the number of thyroid disorders has grown to include at least 1,500 Marshallese who were alive during the testing period. The Marshallese have been trying to get compensation for these kinds of medical problems, and also environmental ones, for the last 3 decades. That Compact of Free Association that we mentioned earlier from 1986, it set up a tribunal to do just that. The U.S. put aside $150 million to pay out claims. But the compact narrowed the scope of damages to just 4 atolls.
Just the 4 atolls of Bikini and Enewetak, where the testing took place, and Rongelap and Utrecht. We know now that all the islands received some level of radiation. We know that now.
So they're reviewing claims.
Claims are adjudicated and evidence is presented and heard. And over time, the tribunal is finding, wow, the scale of damages is really expanding. People are coming from other atolls with claims that are eligible according to the terms that we've established in this program. Here's an award. But the money's dwindling too. And so the tribunal decides to prorate payments and to not pay anyone's award in full to ensure that it can sustain the funding it has in order to take on and to hear more claims, because the claims are just growing and growing.
That's not to mention massive property damage awards for the 4 atolls themselves. At this point, the awards have grown to over $2 billion. And you said there's $150 million in the pot, essentially, to pay these awards.
Right. That was an adjudicated process with experts and specialists. And the only thing standing between a safe island community and not, and what we currently have, is funding. And I just find that such an injustice. I mean, it's funding. It's not like it's impossible. And the petition was submitted in 2000 to Congress, outlining all of this new information that we now have that shows, the scale of damages was much bigger than we thought it was. The needs are much greater. Here's our case. Well, Congress has not responded to that petition, even to now. The Bush administration in 2005 responded and considered that none of the requests constituted changed circumstances as intended by the provisions of Section 177. And that's where we were left off.
Our national security is strengthened because of our ability to maintain the site on the Marshall Islands.
Fast forward to that hearing from October, and there's been a bit of a shift.
Today, these defense capabilities are even more crucial given the Chinese recent missile testing.
One that gives the islands new leverage.
The Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site is located on the Kejuline Atoll. The importance of this site cannot be overstated. We have invested $2 billion in military infrastructure.
See, China's been growing its footprint in the Pacific, handing out disaster relief and loans to island nations. And some experts say that China might even be angling to establish a military presence in the region. China's also getting richer and bolder. And a lot of folks in Congress are concerned about what that might mean for the U.S.
Some may wonder, is the Chinese threat merely hypothetical? Alarmingly, it is not.
So suddenly, it seems like we might want to make nice with countries like the Marshall Islands. So, also suddenly, Congress has started to show an interest in things like the Runit Dome, a nuclear repository that holds millions of cubic feet of radioactive waste, and one that experts have been warning for years is leaking, in part due to rising sea levels caused by climate change. The debate could also impact the future of the compact, which expires in 2023. When it expires, the Biden administration will have to decide whether or not to renew it. And some lawmakers say failing to extend the compact could hand China a win. I just have to ask, how does China fit into this? The testing itself was a response to the Cold War with Russia. Now we've pivoted to the Pacific in response to China. Does this have an uncomfortable, familiar ring?
I'll go back to that 1945 testimony and just replace Soviet Union with China. It's the same tone of conversation. Just today, I read a headline in the Financial Times that China plans to expand its nuclear weapons.
Oh, to 1,000. Yes. Expand its nuclear missiles to 1,000. Rhea's talking about a Pentagon report that said that China could have 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. That's still less than a third of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. But the ramp-up comes as China is acting more and more aggressively toward Taiwan, a U.S. ally.
Yeah, they're going to quadruple the nuclear stockpile by 2030. So, I mean, of course, my first thought after, especially on the heels of the hearing is we just became more important.
There was another wake-up call in 2019. That's when the Solomon Islands and the Pacific nation of Kiribati cut ties with Taiwan and recognized China instead. The Marshall Islands maintains diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and the U.S. wants to keep it that way. So maybe that's one more card to play. Rhea says the China issue is always lurking in the background.
I mean, the title of the hearing made it seem like it was all about the nuclear legacy and the Runit Dome. But if you listen to the hearing, it very much, this was a side dish.
Yeah.
We were kind of a means to an end in a way. I'm okay with that. I think anything that gives us the attention that we need and to bring people to the table. And what I heard from Ranking Member Gosar was very positive on compensation. That's important.
Our compact agreement is a win-win for the United States and the Marshall Islands. In exchange for strategic advantages, the United States provides the Marshall Islands with security and economic assistance.
That's Representative Paul Gosar, a far-right politician from Arizona who, you might remember, was recently stripped of that ranking membership after sharing an anime video that depicted him killing AOC. This all took place before the controversy. But regardless, Rhea was grateful for the opportunity to state her case in front of Congress.
We're not in a position where we can be selective about opportunities. So that was definitely a good one. And, it was a very interesting discussion to be involved in that hearing, to hear the talk about how important the Marshall Islands are as a strategic partner in a strategic location to counter China, as if nobody lives in the Marshall Islands. Yet my piece in the testimony in the hearing was to talk about the human impact. So there was just this real disconnect in the conversation. It was just interesting. My testimony today is a continuation of past testimonies by Marshallese leaders from Bikini, Eniwetok, Rongelap, and Lutheran. A report by the U.S. National Cancer Institute estimated that an additional 500 cancer cases would emerge among Marshallese people exposed during the testing period. That is, many of our islands remain unsafe for resettlement and are in need of remediation. People are facing health challenges that we are ill-equipped to address. And we are at risk of our future generations, like my daughters, not having the knowledge about this.
Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced and edited by Ruth Morris and Calvin Ryerse, with a little help from me. A huge thanks to Ruth for taking the reins while I was away welcoming a new little girl. And to Calvin for working with us on this great piece. As always, Darian Schulman writes the music for our show, and Robin Wise makes each episode sound its best. We want to thank the foundations that make our work possible, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. And thank you to all of you for supporting our show. Don't forget, if you like the show, to leave us a review. You'd be surprised what a difference those make. And as always, you can come and visit us anytime on social at Inkstick Media. We'll see you right back here for a new season in the new year, but stick around for more bonus content in the meantime.
A million tons of water alive with deadly rays. Awe-inspiring in its significance for man, who learned how to control the atom, but must now learn to control himself.